Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ODI. Thank you very much for joining us for our debate today on universal basic income that we hope is going to be very interesting and very engaging. My name is Elizabeth Stewart and I'm head of the Growth, Poverty and Inequality programme here at ODI. Many of you, I think if you're attracted to come and listen to this debate or watch it online, I should say that we've got a very large audience of people watching online, and I should also say please do feel free to tweet the event. You'll see the hashtag there, hashtag UBI debate. But if you've already shown the interest to log on and watch this event or join us here in the room here in London, I'm sure many of you will already be familiar with the basic concept of UBI. It's actually used in slightly different ways. We're talking about unconditional cash that's given to the university of the population, everyone within a country, and that it's not means tested. That's what we're going to be talking about today. It's actually not a new idea. Again, some of you may know that if you're in the room. It's actually been knocking around in policy circles for 50 to 60 years. It's interestingly enough an issue that cuts across right and left kind of debates. It was one of the first proponents of it was Milton Friedman, yet one of the more recent proponents of it has been Barack Obama, and the socialist candidate in the French presidential elections recently also had it on his platform. So really does cut across ideological divides. The reason we're talking about it today is that there are many people around the world who think it's an old idea, but an idea whose time has come. And it's being experimented or piloted or trialled. Obviously, you can't have a complete trial if it's with a limited sample of the population. It's not universal properly. But there are trials attempting to glean initial pieces of information on what universal basic income would look like and what impacts it would have. They're happening in Finland. People have been given $600 a month, randomly selected group of people getting $600 a month. It's going to be happening in India. It's happening in Ontario, in Canada. It's happening in Oakland, California. Give Directly, an NGO, is piloting a 12-year randomly controlled trial in urban areas in Kenya. So this is a very live policy debate. And what we want to see today is just hear some of the arguments about whether this really is a policy for the future or whether this is a policy whose time should never come, to put it bluntly. So before I introduce the speakers, what I want to do is show you the results of a poll that we've been running on Twitter. I should preface this by saying earlier this year, a poll was conducted across Europe of 11,000 people to ask them whether they liked the idea of a UBI, and 68% of respondents said that they did. So let's just see how ODI respondents tallied with that. Yes, agreeing. So 72% saying yes, 28% saying no. I'm going to ask you to take, if you all here in the room now at the start of this, what you think about this. If you could take a minute, if you have your phone, if you could log on to, you can see that it's our Glisser, onto the Glisser site, glisser.it/UBI. If you can type that into your phones, you'll need to give your email as well, and you can tell us what you think about going into the debate, what your currently held view is. And then I'm going to come back to you at the end of the debate and see whether anyone's changed their mind. We might not have an exactly replicated sample, but hopefully most people will stay with us for the hour and a half of the debate. So I'm just going to give you just half a minute to do that now. So glisser.glsr.it/UBI, and it'll say, should there be a universal basic income, yes or no? I can see some people still typing into their phones. Do, of course, people watching online, do please participate in this as well. And do, when we come to the Q&A questions, I've got the iPad here as well, and I'll be taking questions from the online audience around the world. Okay, I think I see enough people putting their phones down. Let's see what the view in the room is and online is at the start. Okay, that's pretty definite. 95%, I don't know what our confidence interval is, but 95% yes. Oh, and it's shifting. Okay, great. Thank you. We could just stay here for an hour and a half and watch that, just, talk amongst ourselves. Let's not do that. Right, let me move rapidly now to introducing our speakers. And I think it's a nice reflection of the fact that this is a genuinely universal issue. This is a live policy discussion in developing and developed countries that we've got. Our panel comes from all around the world. Let me go first to Shanta Devarajan. You can see at the bottom of the screen here, who's waving. Thank you, Shanta. Joining us from DC. Shanta's the chief economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank and has written on UBI fairly extensively. Let me introduce next Shamika Ravi, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution based in Delhi. Thirdly, let me introduce Ilkka Kaukoranta. I've been advised by a Finnish colleague that pronunciation is not too terrible. Ilkka is the chief economist at SAC, which is the largest union representing blue-collar workers in Finland. And lastly, but of course not least, in the room, we have David Pietru, who's a professor of social policy based here in London at the LSE. Now, before I go to our panelists and ask them to make a 2-minute introduction setting out their case, and I will try and stick fairly brutally to timing, so I will cut you off after 2 minutes. Of course, there's going to be plenty of time for debate and to flesh out arguments later on. But before I do that, I wanted to go to my colleague, Francesca Bastagli, who is a principal research fellow here at ODI, specialising in social protection, just to talk us through a little bit more about the sort of the parameters of what we're talking about when we're thinking about UBI. Francesca.
Thank you, Liz. Can you hear me? All right, thank you. So one of the reasons why I think the UBI, the Universal Basic Income, as a concept, but also as a practical policy option is so fascinating, is that it has been debated by a range of disciplines, from political philosophy and sort of theories of social justice to policy debates about what works in poverty reduction or tackling unemployment, unpaid labor, underpaid labor, all the way to debates around how to best ensure that policy reaches the poor, so the administration of policy. And it seems to me that one of the tasks that we have is precisely as we go ahead and discuss this topic is to make sure that we thread together these different strands of arguments and of approaches to the topic. Now, in recent, in the recent renewed interest in the UBI, there are a couple of issues that stand out to me, or points that I'd like to make just before we move on to the speakers. One of these concerns, what is it that we're talking about, right? And you hinted at this, Liz. In practice, particularly in the media coverage of the UBI debate, the expression universal basic income is being used to refer to quite a wide range of types of transfers. And in particular, when we look at specific pilots underway or proposals being debated, we're actually talking about rather different things. They mostly concern cash transfers, but some of these are quite different. For instance, a lot of them include elements of targeting. And I think it's fine to use the expression UBI to refer to a range of different types of transfers, but at the same time, I also think it's important that we are clear about what it is we're talking about. And for instance, in some cases, what we really are talking about is about different approaches to targeting, right? And so to what Tony Atkinson would refer to as degrees of targeting. Is it that a more narrowly targeted policy with high informational requirements that is quite complex to administer, does that perform better than a targeted transfer that is more broadly targeted, that is simpler to administer? So that's the sort of discussion that's actually taking place. The second point that stands out to me concerns the context. So in some countries, the potential for introducing a UBI is being debated within the context of quite substantial cuts in social spending. In other contexts, in other countries, it's being debated alongside the phasing out of existing safety nets or social protection programs. Again, here I think it's quite important that we take the broader policy context into account because the UBI doesn't operate in a vacuum. And the rationale for its introduction and the way it functions in practice will vary hugely depending on what happens to the remainder of the social policy sector. My final point, and then we'll move on, concerns where the funds for UBI come from. There have been a lot of estimates about the cost, but aside from the cost issue, there is an issue about the source of money. We see some headlines about money being free and handed freely, but money isn't free. It comes from somewhere, and this matters. The options range from funding a UBI via general taxation. In some countries, this is revenue that is raised through progressive direct income tax. But other options include raising tax on capital or redistributing wealth from natural resources. In other countries still, some of the low-income countries we're considering, the pilots are being funded entirely externally by donors or charities. And the reasons why this matter, and there are a number of reasons, I'll only mention a few, include what this means for the potential for building institutions, for establishing or strengthening social contracts between the state and the population, and of course for the sustainability of policy over time. So these are just a couple of initial issues, and I'll hand over to the speakers. Thanks.
Thanks very much. That's a really helpful framing kind of conversation, and I'm going to guess where your vote, where it landed. Okay, I'm going to go to the for side first. So I'm going to come first to Shanta. Can I ask you, please, 2 minutes on the clock, your reasons why you are in favour of a UBI? Go.
Okay. 3 reasons, very quickly, 3 very different reasons. One is if you look at the experience of oil-rich countries in Africa, say, they've done a terrible job of using their oil revenues to reduce poverty. And the main reason for that is that the oil revenue comes directly to the government and with very little accountability on how they use it. So we've done some experiments where we look at what would happen if you take that same amount of oil revenue and distribute it to the population in an equal basis. And what we find is that in countries like Equatorial Guinea or Gabon or Angola, if you just take 20% of the oil revenues and distribute it equally to the entire population, you can eliminate poverty in all 3 of those countries. Now, the second reason is that if you leave aside the oil-rich countries, also in the oil-importing countries like India and Egypt, what you have is a whole morass of subsidies aimed at trying to help the poor that are hugely inefficient and in many cases, because of the leakage, don't even reach the poor. And I won't dwell on this because I'm sure Shamika will refer to this, but I actually think if you replace these subsidies with universal cash transfers, you can actually achieve both equity and efficiency and reduce poverty. And then finally, if you look at the rich countries, there's a big debate, as I'm sure Ilka will mention, about technology replacing jobs. But the problem there is that technology is actually useful in increasing the productivity of work. So the real question is not the loss of jobs, but the question of who benefits from this increase in productivity. And again, if you can take this big increase in productivity, this rent, and distribute it as universal basic income, that will free up a lot of people who don't have to continue to try to work in inefficient industries and instead actually be able to do what they really believe in. So for 3 reasons, I think the time for universal basic income has come.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shanta. That was very succinct. Thank you for that. Shamika, let me come to you next because you're also on the pro side. 2 minutes, Shamika.
Thank you. So I'm going to limit myself to the Indian case, though Shanta has already laid out the broad categories under which a UBI is, particularly appealing. In the Indian case, essentially the overriding factor is efficiency, because India does have very many different kinds of subsidies. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, our food program, for instance, which is one of the largest globally, 36% is pure leakage, which means it just disappears in the system. Another 36% goes to the non-poor, which means it is totally mistargeted, and only about 28% really reaches the poor. And this is symptomatic of most subsidy schemes that is being run in the country. So by that metric, and this is where I argue that it cannot be, UBI cannot be a new form of subsidy. It really does have to replace a couple of the existing subsidies, and I basically narrow down to food, fuel, and fertilizer. And together, these three components really amount to 2% of the GDP, which if translated into an UBI is really $4 for a household of 4 people per month. And this amounts to 2% of GDP. We can see a reduction in poverty from 22 to 7%. Now, the fears of moral hazard that we have seen, there's been enough randomized control trials globally to show that people aren't essentially lazy. They find, newer things to do and better things to do with their time and money. So there's no reason to believe that people will overnight become lazy. And I do believe that in India, targeting is a bad idea. It really has to be universal because targeting has led to a big middleman problem, which is the bureaucracy. And just to give you an example, the NREGS, which is the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the most celebrated scheme, the best aspect to that scheme is it's a self-targeted scheme.
Okay.
If you want to work, you can come and get paid. And even there, there is a tremendous amount of leakage in the system. So it has to be universal.
I'm going to cut you off there, Shamika. Okay, we'll come back. We'll come back to more issues on that later. Okay, so that's a very clear setting out there of why this is a good idea. I'm going to come next to Ilkka. Why not? What's your arguments against? 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Finland is running randomized experiments with basic income. I think it's a great thing for social science research, but not a good solution for social policy, certainly not for Finland. Basic income is an efficient way of distributing money, which is not the challenge Finland is facing and that most developed countries are facing. The biggest challenge in social policy is not distributing money, but gathering the money to distribute. We need high employment to have sufficient taxes to fund social benefits we want. Basic income is unconditional. That's the basic idea behind it. It's a beautiful idea, but it's also its key downfall. Conditionality is the way to combine good level of benefits with high employment. Conditionality pushes people towards work, since you lose benefits if you don't apply for work. And so this basic income unconditionality, it gives the unemployed the choice to not work. And this inevitably leads to lower employment. And that leads to cuts to social benefits. So it's a good way of giving out money, but that's not the problem we have. So it's not. I'm convinced that it could be a good solution for India. The leakage problem is not something we have in our social benefit system. It's something like 3% goes to bureaucracy.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Also very short and succinct. Last, David, let me ask you for your 2-minute intervention.
Well, if time permits, I'll argue that I'm in favour of people having a basic income, but the basic income, the universal unconditional basic income, is a very bad way of achieving that. There's still a lot of confusion. I agree with Shanta about in an oil or mineral based economy, a blessing or a curse, a basic income may be a far better way of distributing that income than present systems. In more advanced economies, there's a lot of confusion about the relationship with existing social security. Is it a replacement or is it a supplement? If it's a supplement, recognizing that social security has responded to needs of pensioners, unemployed people, complex disability needs, and children, certainly with tests and conditions, but if you add a basic income into that as well, you're not simplifying anything, you're actually making it more complex. If it's a replacement, an unconditional basic income would either be vastly expensive, I mean, not a few pence, a few percent on income tax, but 20, 30, 40% increase. Or if it wasn't that, it would be way below poverty levels. It would be an almost trivial sum. It's not economically efficient. It's not targeted at the poor. So criticisms of existing systems, such as we just heard from India, is the proposal is to replace it with an even less targeted system. It's not politically feasible. The French presidential first round in which the Parti Socialiste was more or less wiped out, a perhaps Corbynist fate that befell that party. Even then it wasn't a full unconditional basic income they were putting forward. And fundamentally, it's not just. Justice is about more than income, a fair distribution of work and of income. And a lot of the arguments relate to a world of robots in which half or 3/4 of jobs are replaced.
Yeah.
There that you have winners, owners and operators, the rest are nowhere.
Yeah.
So to suggest it's an easy answer to poverty, as a Guardian article put it, is seriously misguided.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we've got entirely opposing views, which always makes for a very, very interesting debate. I mean, let me, David, pick up on one of your points you made towards the end of your presentation and put it directly to Shanta, which is the efficiency argument. How can it be efficient to, if poverty, if ending poverty is one of the objectives of a UBI, would it not, how can it be efficient to give this transfer to everyone? Why would it not be more efficient to really understand the undermining causes of that poverty and deal with those?
The only point we are making, I think both Shamika and I, is that the current system of trying to eliminate poverty is missing the boat. It is grossly inefficient. And the reason it's inefficient is that governments are actually manipulating that system for their own benefit. That's the leakage that Shamika was talking about with the public distribution system in India. So all we're saying is that you can actually improve the efficiency with which you reduce poverty, paradoxically, by giving out the same amount to everybody, because that same amount makes it very hard for politicians to manipulate it. People can, whenever you have a targeted cash transfer, and we've seen this time and time again in developing countries, politicians will manipulate it, the eligibility, in order to benefit their particular constituency. And that's when the leakage starts. So if instead you say everybody gets the same amount, and incidentally, if everyone gets the same amount, it actually means a lot more to poor people. So it has a progressive element in it. But the most important thing is you can't manipulate it. Everybody knows how much they're supposed to get, and you can make sure they get it. And that is a very powerful way of reducing poverty.
Okay. Shamika, can I pick you up on, I mean, you talked about the experiment, the pilot in India at the moment, and talked a little bit about coverage. I know that at the moment the Ministry of Finance has said that coverage is likely to be of 93% of the population, because that's the percentage of the population who's covered by the citizen registration scheme, the Aadhaar scheme. I have a question about inequality, which is, again, something that David had picked up on. Admittedly, 93% is better coverage, the point you made, it's better coverage than some of the existing systems at the moment, not least the public distribution system. But you're still leaving out a sizable, less than single digit, but still sizable percentage of the population who will, by very definition, because they are the uncounted, they're left out of the census, they're left out of surveys, already most likely be the people who are the poorest and most disadvantaged in the population. Are you not just exacerbating that inequality if we think about a sort of leave no one behind argument?
Sure. So to answer that immediate question, let me tell you that, UIDAI, which is the Aadhaar, the unique identification, we reached 93% about 6 months back. But there is an incredible drive and outreach to really enroll more and more part of the population. I'd like to actually go back to the efficiency argument, because there's something I'd like to add to that. And one is that, poverty itself is not a static idea. People are constantly moving above and below the poverty line. So in the Indian case, if we believe that we can really target them accurately in a long run, it's not an efficient way to think about it. That's number one. And number two, if we can actually over time improve our tax network, then you can even make it revenue neutral for the rich and make it like a negative income tax for the poor. So over time, you can actually design a system which becomes even more efficient, where the distortion can be that more is taken away from the rich as a means of negative tax, and you really give it to the poor. as an expanded, universal basic income. So it really is a universal basic income. The simplicity is that targeting can be out of the, the equation, because that essentially is the biggest chink in the Indian experiment.
Okay, let me pick some of those arguments to David, then I'll come to you, Ilka. But I mean, at its crudest, if you like, how can we, if the figures we've heard are correct, and I know the Ministry of Finance in India has confirmed that they think they can get Indian poverty down to 7% through a UBI. Current poverty reduction efforts have made extraordinary strides in the last 20 years, but we know there are significant pockets of poverty that remain. If this is something that's going to work, how can we be against this? In an area of policy that perhaps needs new thinking and new initiatives and new ideas, and it's replacing some regressive, we know fossil fuel subsidies are regressive, if it is replacing rather than complementing those inefficiencies, how can we be against it, to put it crudely?
Well, in theory, it's very easy to abolish poverty. You give poor people enough money and you tax people better off.
That's the argument.
But is that going to happen? Our administrative systems, which may not be very open, maybe subject to manipulation, are we to believe that one simplified system is going to cease to be any possibility of corruption of that system, people's being allowed to register who don't exist, or some people being excluded because they're in unpopular minorities? I don't think that those problems are suddenly going to disappear wholly because we have one simple system and because it's computerized. That I think that's putting a trust in technology, which if there is the openness, if there's desire to tackle those problems at a high enough level, then they would have been tackled. I mean, there are forces that don't want to redistribute resources, that don't want to get benefits to those who really need them. And those will, if they can be tackled, then yes, poverty can be tackled in lots of ways, and other ways rather more efficient than a basic income.
Okay, we'll come on to the political aspect of this later. I wanted to pick up now on the jobs, on the employment aspect. And Ilka, I mean, very interesting. It feels a little bit counterintuitive, actually, that a union would be opposing this, when actually improving situations of precarity in the workforce is one of the reasons why the UBI is being posited. But I wanted to come back and ask you about the automation question, which again is another reason, another part of the rationale for a UBI, particularly in developed economies. It's less of a work done by colleagues at ODI actually shows that automation, or indicates that automation is less of an immediate threat in developing countries. But in a kind of an OECD country context, do you not think, if the jobs are going to be taken away by robots, to put it crudely, people are going to need something to live on? Does that not work as an argument for you in the Finnish context?
I think the robot argument is a very good argument for having social benefits, having unemployment benefits, and education benefits, all sorts of social policy. But the biggest challenge robots and the loss of jobs creates is the fact that the tax base erodes. If we lose, if employment goes down, there's simply not enough people to tax, and the government finances are hit hard, and it makes money even tighter. And shifting from a targeted social benefit system to a UBI scheme is less efficient in the sense that you need instead of giving money only to the poor, you give it also to rich people, and you simply have to have a larger amount of tax revenue to fund a UBI scheme that is of similar level. So robots, it's a real challenge, but again, it's a challenge for for the revenue side, and UBI is a solution for giving out money, which, as I said, at least in Finland, that's not a challenge we have. Giving out money is actually quite easy for our bureaucracy.
So it's an answer to the wrong question in
Exactly.
the Finnish context. Okay, David, let me ask you a similar question, but also we were talking a little bit earlier about informality, and that if you are, at the moment, social protection tends to be something that comes to you by virtue of being in employment. It's being part of the workforce. And if you're employed in the informal economy, then you're usually left out of any forms of social protection. So let me ask you, David, is there not an argument then that UBI would then explicitly bring informal workers into some kind of a protection or give them some kind of benefit, some kind of ex-ante security?
Well, again, the question is how much would they get? If it's way below any sort of poverty level, then they're dependent on other sources to get by. I think the idea that, in general, trying to get more informal work to be formalised and under better conditions and properly paid, so that lots of the work that predominantly women do in childcare, in care of disabled people, in caring in the community, has been almost wholly unrewarded, and that doesn't seem to me a good thing in principle. So if you're actually encouraging that to happen, it seems to me to be going in the wrong direction. I think it's important to remember that the choice has been put by several people as sort of UBI or targeted social security. Targeted social security is targeted at certain groups. It doesn't have to be complex means tests. It may be targeted at children. It may be targeted at groups who are disabled with certain categories of disability. It may be targeted, as in South Africa, at elderly people with very simple tests of
So sort of
age.
variants of, not UBI, but sort of variants of it.
Yes.
Yeah, you're playing around with the universality. That's the aspect of it that you find problematic,
Yeah,
not the
targeted
basic
doesn't
and not
have
the
to
income.
mean complex tests. In Britain, there's this macabre test being considered that to get child benefits for third and subsequent children, poor mothers are having to provide evidence that they were raped.
Yeah.
That's an appalling conditionality.
Yeah.
But general conditionality exists. In relation to age, in relation to work, in relation to household size, and no one's saying. Well, in fact, one's saying that if you're trying to target needs, they are actually good conditions.
So let me put some of that to you, Shanta, and add the question. I think it was Ilka, you talked about kind of encouraging people out of the labour force, and you've mentioned that as well. There's a nicely titled paper, Shanta, I'm sure you'll be familiar with it, that talks about should we pay surfers to surf off Malibu? Is UBI just going to mean we can all sit at home watching daytime TV and eating crisps? Is that what? Where do you sit on that argument? I'm very pro daytime TV and crisps, I should state at this point.
Yeah, and surfing in Malibu actually sounds pretty good.
Right.
No, I think it's a reasonable question to ask whether this is going to lead to a reduction in labor supply. But the overwhelming evidence that I've seen of all these comparisons of conditional versus unconditional cash transfers in rich and poor countries show that it doesn't have that effect. In fact, I think UBI will actually release people to pursue jobs, including part-time jobs. And that's the debate in Finland right now, is that many of the people are afraid to take, many of the unemployed are afraid to take part-time jobs because they'll lose their unemployment benefits, even though those part-time jobs might be the most productive things they can do. So I think but it's actually the reverse, that UBI releases people to pursue those things that they are most productive at. And you could actually end up with a more productive economy by not having to link your income with your salary, your job, your payment for jobs. You could have many more artists. You could have many more musicians. who can pursue, and if they have talent for music, they can pursue their talent and their creative energies without having to get another job in order to earn a salary.
Okay, very interesting. And just quickly, last question around the sort of jobs issue. Shamika, if I may, I'm interested in the issue of decent work, which you know is a hard fought for term that's now accepted within the concept of thinking about labour markets. It's part of the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. Do you think there might be a danger that UBI is effectively a kind of a SOP that says, okay, we don't need to think about some of the structural problems in the labour market now. We don't need to think about the work being decent. We don't need to worry about other problems with the labour market because we have the UBI and that answers everything.
Well, essentially that goes back to whether the labour supply will, go backwards. Essentially it's the same question. There is reason to believe, the nature of the transfer is so small in the Indian case that it's unlikely to make, these kind of distortions in the short run. And remember, similar arguments were given when NREGS was implemented, that, the government is basically going to guarantee 100 days of wage employment. So people will not want to go out and seek jobs. And that actually, the empirical evidence, if anything, is really to the contrary. First of all, the government does not have the capacity to create as much job. And remember back in UK, about 200 years back, when the whole idea of these, workstations and job sites were created, they had to be so appalling that people only went there as a last, a resort. And in the NREG's case, you have to work outside in, in the heat tilling land.
Yeah.
So the design of these schemes are such that it has not led to a backward, bend in the supply. What it has done, however, is that it has raised the minimum wage. Now, remember, in a labor-abundant economy like India, you can never enforce minimum wage laws unless you really do something like this. Because, there are so many informal contracts and the informal economy is so large that in some sense NREG has also done well for the formal labor market itself.
Okay. Let me come back to you first with the final sort of area I want to probe around the UBI question, and that is what it may potentially do for good and for ill around issues of social cohesion. I mean, this is clearly a very pertinent question in lots of different country contexts right now, the sort of sense of whether there's enough social capital between people or whether that's being undermined at the moment. I mean, let me start with the basic question around who do we think should be eligible for something like a UBI? I mean, clearly in India, it's if you are registered with Aadhaar, with the Citizens Registration Scheme. But this raises questions about, for me, it raises questions about, for instance, the role of migrants in a society. I mean, what do we mean? What are the implications for citizenship of this kind of program? Is it okay if you've been here for a year or in the country for a year? Do you have to have been there for 5 years? What do you think? I mean, talk to me about some of the implications you think for migration as a governance expert.
To whom are you addressing this question?
Sorry, this is to Shamika. So my question is, as a governance expert, do you not think, I'm sure you're thinking about migration and the intersection between migration and the UBI, do you not think this could actually be a divisive tool if you're saying you have to have been a citizen for 5 years, 10 years to be eligible for this, that this could actually further divide societies?
Well, you see, that is the reason why there is a separation between the citizen registry of the Home Ministry and the Aadhaar, which was really an outcome of the Planning Commission, that Aadhaar is not linked to citizenship. So if UBI is going to be based on Aadhaar, then it's automatically de-linked from citizenship. Mm-hmm. But remember that, being a poor country and the resources being limited, and with increased fiscal devolution, the states are going to have a greater say on exactly how much will be, transferred. And in that case, it's very difficult to predict whether each state is going to have, very similar policies. Remember, NREGA, again, the wages are very different across different states.
Okay, let me ask you the same question. Shamik is responding specifically for the Indian context. I mean, same question for you for other country contexts. Could this be divisive depending on eligibility criteria?
I don't think so, because it's really, look at the way we treat migrants now. I mean, migrants still have to get work permits and be eligible for work in the current system. And it's going to be something similar to that, being eligible for universal basic income. It's whether you've been in the country for 1 or 2 years or 5 years or whatever. I don't know whether this can be seen as more divisive than what the current situation. And I don't need to mention the kind of treatment that migrants are experiencing in the United States to tell you that even without universal basic income, there are lots of problems.
Okay.
So I don't think that's the big issue. Can I just use my time to just make one other point about what Ilka said, which is that we need to maintain employment in order to generate revenues, tax revenues. Well, that's because we are currently basing the tax system on employment taxes, or whereas if you think of it as an income tax, if you're taxing incomes, regardless of whether you're employed or not, then that changes your tax base. And you should only adopt something, an employment program, or you adopt technology. If you take a technology that increases productivity in the economy, even if it sheds labor, that increase in productivity will lead to an increase in the tax base. Okay. You will actually earn more revenue rather than less revenue, and then you can distribute that revenue as a universal basic income, so the people who lost their jobs won't be suffering.
Okay, I'm going to put that directly to you, Ilka, and then I'm going to come to David with a last question from me on social cohesion. But Ilka, do you want to respond to that one, Shanta's question directly?
Yes, please. In principle, yes, it goes exactly as Shanta described. The problem is that the owners of the robots, the owners of the algorithms, are not necessarily within the same country as those who are losing their jobs. So it's if we had one global tax man, this would be an easy problem to solve. But the fact is that we don't, and the owners of that sort of information capital are highly mobile. We can't get people from Silicon Valley to move to Finland by offering them 80% tax rates. It's just not feasible, and for that reason, lower employment would be a problem for tax collection, regardless of whether there's other high income people elsewhere to tax. Okay. But going back to the social cohesion question, if I could.
Yeah, please.
In Finland, we considered very important that our social benefit system is universal, applies to everyone who lives in Finland, regardless of nationality. And moving to a UBI scheme, it would of course mean that all migrants are also within UBI. And we want our social benefit system to provide a decent level of living, not simply to survive, but to be able to take your kids and go on holiday once in a while, a real decent level of living. Currently, the benefit system is conditional. It means that we push people towards education and towards work, and especially for migrants, it's very important that people they integrate into the society. And pushing people towards education and language training and work is a good way to ensure that people actually do become integrated. Simply offering 600, 800 euros a month unconditionally would, I think, lead to much lower social cohesion. It would exclude some people permanently from the job market, and that would be a dystopian future.
Okay. Taking the idea of a dystopian future, my last question, David, to you before I open this out to the audience is, I mean, in some ways it seems instinctive that everybody getting the same amount in a country reduces some of the social stigma of people being welfare claimants or benefits claimants. There's lots of very negative terminology around this in the English language and sort of connected sort of in the discourse, certainly in the UK and I'm sure in other countries as well. Isn't, you know, everybody getting the same amount? Then it doesn't matter that you are, whether you're having to depend on that income or whether you have other sources of income. You remove the stigma. But it also, because it's cash, it gives agency to people to make their own decisions about how that money is spent.
Well, the crucial question in that is how big is that amount? I mean, some people like neocons like Charles Murray are proposing a pretty low level and then saying, well, let's abolish the education system, the health system, and let people survive, and that will encourage them to provide for themselves.
But if it's not either or, if it's in addition to...
Well, if it's an addition, then it's not determining their net income. That depends on I mean, quite rightly, there are quite high disability benefits for some because most people think they should have a fair share of income, and having a very low basic income just seems to me tacking on a rather useless component. That for social cohesion, then the whole system needs to be thought of as fair. And I don't disagree with Shanta that it'd be good to have more artists and musicians, but most people who are working hard at dull, boring jobs are not really willing to support people in doing that or surfing off Malibu because they're not enjoying those ways of life. They may be willing to provide a very low level of benefit, which is not enough to live on, but then what's the point, really? Okay. But I think it's wrong to think about fairness, justice, just in terms of a benefit system. It's also about the distribution of work and what people are doing, how people are contributing to the society. And that is, as Tony Atkinson argued, that there should be conditions on getting what he called a participation income, which is not unconditional.
Okay. So there being some greater purpose to conditionality as well beyond the specific condition.